In 1944, Germany had a fighter aircraft nearly 100 miles per hour faster than anything the Allies could put in the sky. A genuine technological leap, years ahead of anything else flying in that war. It could have seriously disrupted Allied bombing campaigns over Germany. Instead, it spent much of its short combat career being used for exactly the wrong job, because one man overruled his own engineers and Air Force generals and insisted on using it completely differently than it was designed for. That man was Adolf Hitler, and this is the story of the Me-262. Later in this video, we're going to look at the exact moment German fighter pilots, flying the most advanced aircraft in the world, found themselves nearly helpless against a threat nobody had designed the plane to survive, not because the jet failed them, but because of when and how it was being used. It's one of the more frustrating what-if moments in the entire war. But first, let's talk about how Germany built a jet fighter years before anyone else made one work. By the late 1930s, German engineers, working largely independently from similar research happening in Britain, had made real progress on a genuinely new kind of aircraft propulsion: the jet engine. Unlike a propeller engine, which relies on spinning blades to pull air and generate thrust, a jet engine compresses air, mixes it with fuel, ignites it, and blasts the resulting exhaust out the back at high speed, producing dramatically more power at high altitudes and high speeds than any propeller design could match. Development of what would become the Me-262 began in the late 1930s, with the aircraft's basic airframe design largely finalized well before its engines were actually ready for reliable use. This is an important detail because it means the airframe, the sleek, swept-wing shape that made the plane so fast, wasn't the bottleneck holding the program back. It was the engines that delayed everything for years. Early jet engines were plagued with reliability problems. They had painfully short operational lifespans, sometimes needing replacement after just a handful of flight hours, and they were prone to flaming out entirely if a pilot moved the throttle too aggressively. Getting these engines from experimental prototypes to something reliable enough for combat aircraft took Germany years longer than initially hoped, delaying the Me-262's combat debut well past when the airframe itself was essentially ready to fly. Once the engines were finally reliable enough for service, the results were dramatic. The Me-262 could reach speeds of roughly 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied propeller-driven fighters of the same period, like the P-51 Mustang or Spitfire. In a straight-line chase, nothing the Allies had could catch it. Its armament was equally serious. 4 30mm cannons mounted in the nose, giving it enough firepower to potentially down a heavy bomber with just a few solid hits, compared to the many more rounds typically needed from smaller caliber machine guns on conventional fighters. Against the massive formations of American B-17 and B-24 bombers pounding German cities and industry, a fast, heavily armed interceptor like this represented a genuinely serious threat. Allied pilots who encountered it in combat reported a mixture of alarm and reluctant admiration. There simply wasn't a reliable tactic for a propeller fighter to outfly or outfight something moving nearly 100 miles per hour faster in level flight. The only real countermeasures Allied forces developed involved catching Me-262s at their most vulnerable moments, taking off, landing, or flying at low speed when the jet lost its decisive speed advantage. Here's where the story turns from impressive engineering to genuine strategic tragedy, and it centers on a single, stubborn decision by Adolf Hitler himself. German Air Force leadership, including test pilots and engineers who had flown the aircraft, wanted the Me-262 deployed as what it was actually designed to be, a fast interceptor fighter, purpose-built to attack Allied bomber formations before they could devastate German cities and factories. This made complete tactical sense given the aircraft's speed and firepower. Hitler, however, became fixated on a different idea. He wanted the Me-262 configured as a fast bomber, a blitz bomber, capable of striking back at Allied forces, particularly to support German ground troops during the Allied invasion of France in 1944. Despite objections from his own generals and aircraft designers, who argued the plane's design simply wasn't optimized for the bomber role, and that converting it would waste its greatest advantage, Hitler insisted. And for a significant stretch of the program, resources were redirected toward this bomber configuration instead of the fighter role the aircraft was actually built for. This delay and misdirection meant that by the time the Me-262 was finally deployed in meaningful numbers as the interceptor it was designed to be, it was already 1944, moving into 1945, far too late in the war for even a genuinely superior aircraft to meaningfully change Germany's overall strategic situation. Historians, and even some contemporary German officers, have pointed to this decision as one of the more frustrating, self-inflicted delays of the entire war. A genuinely superior weapon held back for months by a single leader's tactical preference, against the advice of the very people who understood the aircraft best. Now, back to that teaser. Even once the Me-262 was finally flying as an interceptor, it faced a problem no amount of speed could fully solve. It was devastatingly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. At low speed, close to the ground, with engines still spooling up or throttled back for approach, the jet lost virtually all of its famous speed advantage, and its acceleration out of a stall or a slow turn was notably sluggish compared to propeller fighters at those same low speeds. Allied pilots figured this out quickly and began specifically loitering near known German jet airbases, waiting for Me-262s to take off or come into land, and attacking them at precisely their most vulnerable moment. Some German jet squadrons responded by having propeller-driven fighters fly protective cover specifically during these vulnerable takeoff and landing windows, a strange irony, where Germany's most advanced aircraft needed older, slower planes to physically guard it during the only part of its flight where its greatest strength didn't apply. This created a genuinely tense, high-stakes few minutes at the start and end of every Me-262 mission, where pilots flying the fastest fighter in the world were, for a brief window, essentially sitting targets. Several of Germany's most experienced jet pilots were lost specifically during these vulnerable phases, not in the high-speed combat the aircraft excelled at. A few facts worth knowing. It very nearly wasn't ready in time for any of this to matter. Beyond the engine reliability problems, Allied bombing campaigns specifically targeted German jet engine production facilities once Allied intelligence became aware of the program, further slowing an already delayed development timeline. Some Me-262s were adapted for genuinely unusual roles. Beyond fighter and bomber variants, a small number were configured as night fighters, fitted with radar equipment to intercept Allied bombers flying nighttime raids, an early and technically ambitious combination of jet propulsion and radar-guided interception that wouldn't become a mature, common combination in aviation for years after the war. A number of captured examples directly shaped post-war jet development. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union studied captured Me-262 airframes and engine designs closely, and design elements, particularly around swept-wing aerodynamics, influenced early post-war jet fighter development in both countries, a rare case of Nazi Germany's wartime engineering directly and openly informing the design language of the aircraft that followed it. Its pilots included some of Germany's most experienced remaining aces. Given the plane's complexity and the ongoing pilot shortage plaguing Germany by 1944, Me-262 squadrons were often staffed with some of the most veteran pilots still available, since flying and fighting effectively in the jet required genuinely different skills and reflexes compared to propeller aircraft. This is the question that tends to come up whenever the Me-262 gets discussed, and it's worth handling carefully rather than overselling it.
Even if Hitler had immediately approved full-scale interceptor deployment the moment the aircraft was ready, Germany was still facing overwhelming Allied numerical superiority in aircraft, pilots, fuel, and industrial capacity by 1944. A faster, better-armed interceptor fielded a few months earlier likely would have inflicted heavier losses on Allied bomber formations and forced some tactical adjustments. But it's a significant stretch to suggest it would have meaningfully changed the war's overall outcome. What it almost certainly would have done is cost the Allies more aircraft and more experienced aircrew than actually occurred, and potentially bought Germany's air defense a few more difficult months. The honest assessment sits somewhere between irrelevant detail and war-changing weapon, a real tactical asset mishandled by leadership that mattered without being decisive. The Me-262 is, in some ways, the mirror image of the Volkssturmgewehr we covered in the last video. One was a weapon built from nothing, handed to people with no training, representing a country with no resources left. The other was a genuine technological triumph, years ahead of anything else in the sky, undermined not by lack of resources or lack of skill, but by a single, stubborn decision from the very top of Germany's leadership. Sometimes a weapon's story isn't about whether the engineering worked. It's about whether the people in charge of using it actually understood what they had. And in the case of the Me-262, that understanding arrived months too late to matter. If you want to see the aircraft the Me-262 was originally built to shoot down, and just how badly outmatched Allied bomber crews sometimes felt facing it, let me know in the comments.